Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
The Darkness Inside, Volume 3. The Story. This story was in the papers in early 1900. It created a sensation at the time. The story shows that black art, with all its mysteries, is not a thing of the past. This is what happened. There was a certain rich European contractor in the central provinces in India. Let's call him Anderson. He used to supply stone ballast to the railway companies and had been doing this business for over a quarter of a century. He had accumulated wealth and was a multimillionaire and one of the richest men in this part of the country. The district which he made his headquarters was a large one. It was a second-class military station, and there were 2 European regiments and 1 Indian regiment in that station. Necessarily, there was a number of European military officers, besides a number of civil and executive officers in that station. On a certain June morning, which is very hot month in India, an Indian fakir came into the compound of Mr. Anderson begging for alms. Mr. Anderson and his wife were sitting in the veranda drinking their morning tea. It had been a very hot night, and there being no electricity in this particular station, Mr. Anderson had to depend on the sleepy punkah coolie. The punkah coolie on this particular night was more sleepy than usual, and so Mr. Anderson had passed a very sleepless night indeed. He was in a very bad temper. A whole life passed among Indian workmen does not generally make a man good-tempered, and a hot June in the Indian plains is not particularly conducive to sweet temper either. When this beggar came in, Mr. Anderson was in a very bad mood. As the man walked fearlessly up to the veranda, Mr. Anderson's temper became worse. He asked the beggar what he wanted. The beggar answered he wanted food, of course. Mr. Anderson said he had nothing to give. The beggar replied that he would accept some money and buy the food. Mr. Anderson was not in the habit of being contradicted. He lost his temper, abused the beggar, and ordered his servants to turn the man out. The servants obeyed. Before his departure, the beggar turned to Mr. Anderson and told him that very soon he would know how painful it was to be hungry. When the beggar was gone, Mr. Anderson thought of his last remark and laughed. He was a well-known rich man and a good paymaster. An order for $100 on a dirty slip of paper would be honored by his banker without hesitation. Naturally, he laughed. He forgot that men had committed suicide by drowning to avoid death from thirst. Well, there it was. The bell announcing breakfast rang punctually at 10 o'clock in the morning. Mr. Anderson joined his wife in the drawing room, and they went to the dining room together. The smell of eggs and bacon and coffee greeted them, and Mr. Anderson forgot all about the Indian beggar when he took his seat. But he received a rude shock. There was a big live caterpillar in the fish. Mr. Anderson called the servant and ordered him to take away the fish and serve with ice the next time. The servant, who had been in Mr. Anderson's service a long time, stared open-mouthed. Only a minute before there was nothing but fish on the plate. Whence came this ugly creature? Well, the plate was removed and another put in its place for the next dish. When the next dish came, another surprise awaited everybody. As the cover was removed, it was found that the whole contents were covered with a thin layer of sweepings. The khansama, the servant who serves at the table, looked at Mr. Anderson, and Mr. Anderson at the khansama. With a wild surmise, the cover was replaced and the dish taken away. Nothing was said this time. After about 5 minutes of waiting, a third covered dish was brought. When the cover was removed, the contents were found mixed with stable sweepings. The smell was horrible. The dish was at once removed. This is about the limit. No man can eat after that. Mr. Anderson left the table and went to his office without breakfast. It was the habit of Mr. Anderson to have his lunch in his office. A khansama used to take a tiffin basket to the office, and there in his private room Mr. Anderson ate his lunch punctually at 2 p.m. Today expected his tiffin early. He thought that though he had left no instructions himself, the khansama would have the sense to remember that he had not gone to office without breakfast, and so Mr. Anderson expected a lunch heavier than usual, and earlier too. But it was 2 o'clock and the servant had not arrived. Mr. Anderson was a man of particularly regular habits. He was very hungry. The thought of the beggar in the morning made him angry too. He shouted to his punkah kula to pull harder. It was 2:15 and still the khansama would not arrive. It was probably the first time in 20 years that the fellow was late. Mr. Anderson sent his chaprasi or peon to look for the khansama at about 2:30. A couple of minutes after the chaprasi's departure, Mr. Atkins, the collector of the district, was announced. A collector is generally a district magistrate also, and in the central provinces he is called a deputy of commissioner. He is one of the principal officers in the district. In this particular district of which I am speaking, there were two principal government officers. The divisional judge was the head of the civil administration, as well as the person who tried the murderers and all the other big offenders who deserved more than 7 years imprisonment. He was a Bengal Brahmin. Mr. Atkins was the collector, or rather the deputy commissioner. He was the executive head of the district. He was also the district magistrate. Mr. Atkins came in and thus explained a sad accident which Mr. Anderson's khansama had met with. As I was passing along the road in my motor car, your man came in the way and was knocked down. The man is hurt, but not badly. He had been carrying a tiffin basket which was also knocked down, as a matter of course, and the car having passed over it, everything the basket contained in the shape of china was smashed up. The man has been taken to the hospital by myself in an unconscious condition, but the doctor says there is nothing very serious, and he will be all right in a couple of days. Now, Mr. Atkins was a great friend of Mr. Anderson. They had known each other ever since Mr. Atkins' arrival in India as a young member of the civil service. That was over 20 years ago. He had at first been in the district for over 7 years as an assistant commissioner, and this time he was there for over 3 years as a deputy commissioner. But Mr. Anderson was very hungry. The story of Mr. Atkins had given him the second shock since the morning. He therefore used language which no gentleman should have done, and with great vehemence threatened to prosecute Mr. Atkins for rash driving, etc. Mr. Atkins was a very good-natured man. He knew the temper of Mr. Anderson, but he had never seen Anderson so angry before. He therefore beat a hasty retreat, wondering whether Anderson had not gone mad. He would not have told anybody what happened in Anderson's office if he had known the starving condition of the millionaire. But as it happened, he repeated the fine language that Anderson had used in the club that same evening. Everybody who heard the story opined at the time that Anderson was clearly off his head. Mr. Anderson and his wife were expected at the club, but they did not turn up. When Mr. Atkins went home, he got a letter from Anderson in which the latter had apologized for what he had said in the office that afternoon. In the letter there was a sentence which was rather enigmatic. If you know what I am suffering from, Atkins, you will be sorry for me, not angry with me. I pray to God you may not suffer such. The letter had evidently been written in great haste and had not been revised. Mr. Atkins thought that Anderson had lost some of his money. He knew that Anderson never speculated. Still, he might have suffered a heavy loss in one of his contracts. He telephoned to Mr. Anderson at his house, but was informed by one of the servants that the master had gone out in his motor car at 6 in the evening and had not come back yet. Now, let us see what happened to Mr. Anderson after he left his office at about 4 in the afternoon. He went home and expected some tea, but no tea arrived, though it was 6. The khansama was in the hospital, the cook was called, and he humbly offered the following explanation. As soon as Hazur, your honor, came back, I ordered the khitmagar, the cook's assistant, to put the kettle on the fire. This is the ordinary duty of the khitmagar. There was a bright coal fire in the stove, and the khitmagar put the kettle upon it. The kettle should have boiled within 5 minutes, but it did not. Your humble servant went to investigate the cause and found that there was no water in the kettle. We put in some, but the kettle had in the meantime become nearly red hot. As soon as it came into contact with the cold water, it burst like a bomb. Fortunately, nobody was hurt. There was, of course, a saucepan to heat some water in. The cold water had gotten to the stove and extinguished it. There would be another half an hour before tea was ready, he added. Mr. Anderson now realized that it was not the fault of the servant, but the curse of the Indian fakir. So with a sad smile he ordered his motor car and thought that he and his wife had better try the railway refreshment rooms. When his chauffeur was going to start the engine, Mr. Anderson expected that there would be a backfire and the chauffeur would have dislocated a wrist, but there was no accident. The engine started as smoothly as it had never done before. Mr. and Mrs. Anderson went to the railway refreshment rooms. There they were informed that no tea was available. A dead rat had been found under one of the tables in the first-class refreshment room, and as plague cases had been reported earlier in the week, the station master had ordered the rooms to be closed till they had been thoroughly disinfected. The whole staff of waiters, with all the preserved meat and oilment stores, had been sent by special train to the next station so that the railway passengers might not be inconvenienced. The next station was 8 miles off, and there was no road for a motor car. I had expected as much, said Mr. Anderson bitterly, as he left the railway station. I will go to Captain Fraser and beg for some dinner. He is the only man who has got a family here and will be able to accommodate us, said he to his wife, and so off they started for a 5-mile run to the cantonments. There was some trouble with the car on the way, and they were detained for about an hour, and it was actually 8:30 in the evening when the Andersons reached Captain Fraser's place. Why, instead of going home from the railway station, Mr. Anderson went to Captain Fraser's place, he himself could not tell. When the Andersons reached Captain Fraser's place at 8:30 in the evening, Mr. and Mrs. Fraser had not come back from the club, but they were expected any minute. It was in fact 9 when the captain and his wife turned up in a hackney carriage. They were surprised to see the Andersons. They had heard the story told by Atkins at the club. Anderson gave him his version. Of course, Captain Fraser asked them to stay to dinner. He said, I am very sorry I am late, but it could not be helped. When returning from the club, my horse was alarmed at something. The coachman lost control and there was a disaster. But thank God nobody is seriously hurt. Their carriage had, however, been so badly damaged that they had to get a hackney carriage to bring them home. In India, especially in June, they are not particular about dress. So Captain Fraser said they would sit down to dinner at once, and at 9:15 they all went in to dine. The khansama stared at the uninvited guests. He knew that something had gone wrong with Anderson Sahib. The soup was the first thing brought in, and the trouble began as soon as it came. Captain Fraser's khansama was an old hand at his business, but somehow he made a mess of things. He got so nervous about what he himself could not explain that he upset a full plate of soup that he had brought for Mr. Anderson. Not exactly on his head, but on his left ear. Well, the reader would understand the situation. There was a plateful of hot soup on Mr. Anderson's left ear. The soup should have got cold because it had waited long for the captain's return from the club, but the cook had very prudently warmed it up again and had become very warm indeed. Mr. Anderson shouted, and the khansama let go the plate. It fell on the table in front of Mr. Anderson, on its edge, and rolled on. Next to Mr. Anderson was Mrs. Fraser, and there was a glass of ice water in front of her. The rolling soup plate upset the glass, and the water and the glass and the plate all came down on Mrs. Fraser's lap, the ice water making her wet through and through. She was putting on a muslin gown. She had to go and change. Mrs. Anderson at this point got up and said that they would not spoil the Frasers' dinner by their presence. She said that the curse of the Indian fakir was upon them, and if they stayed, the Frasers would have to go without dinner. Naturally, she anticipated that some further difficulty would arise there when the next dish was brought in. The Frasers protested loudly, but she dragged Mr. Anderson away. She had forgotten that she had had her lunch and her husband had not. While going in their motor car from Mr. Fraser's house to their own, they had to pass a bazaar on the way. In the bazaar there was a sweetmeat shop. Mr. Anderson, whose condition could be better imagined than described, asked his chauffeur to stop at the sweetmeat shop. It was a native shop with a fat native proprietor sitting without any covering upon his body on a low stool. As soon as he saw Mr. Anderson and his wife, he rushed out of his shop with joined palms to inquire what the gentleman wanted. Mr. Anderson was evidently very popular with the native tradesmen and shopkeepers. This shopkeeper had special reason to know Mr. Anderson, as it was the latter's custom to give a dinner to all his native workmen on Her Majesty's birthday, and this particular sweetmeat vendor used to get the contract for the catering. The birthday used to be observed in India on the 24th of May, and it was hardly a fortnight that this man had received a check for a pretty large amount from Mr. Anderson for having supplied Mr. Anderson's native workmen with sweets. Naturally, he rushed out of his shop in that humble attitude, but in doing so he upset a whole dish full of sweets, and the big dish with the sweets went into the roadside drain. All the same man came up and wanted to know the pleasure of the Sahib. Mr. Anderson told him that he was very hungry and wanted something to eat. Certainly, Hazur, said the Hawaii, which is an Indian confectioner, and fussily rushed in. He brought out some native sweets and a dana, a cup made of leaves. But as misfortune would have it, Mr. Anderson could not eat anything. There was any amount of petroleum in the sweets. How it got in there was a mystery. Mr. Anderson asked the chauffeur to proceed. For fear of hurting the feelings of this kind old Hawal, Mr. Anderson did not do anything then, but scarcely had the car gone 200 yards when the dona with its contents untouched was on the road. Mr. Anderson reached home at about 10:30. He expected to find no dinner at home, but he was relieved to hear from his bearer that dinner was ready. He rushed into his bathroom, had a cold bath, and within 5 minutes was ready for dinner in the dining room. But the dinner would not come. After waiting for about 15 minutes, the bearer, butler, and footman combined, was dispatched to the kitchen to inquire what the matter was. The cook came with a sad look upon his face, and informed him that the dinner had been ready since 8:30 as usual, but as the Sahib had not returned, he had kept the food in the kitchen and come out leaving the kitchen door open. Unfortunately, Mr. Anderson's dog had finished the dinner in his absence, probably thinking that the master was dining out. In a case like this, the cook, who had been in Mr. Anderson's service for a long time, expected to hear some hard words. But Mr. Anderson only laughed loud and long. The cook suggested that he should prepare another dinner, but Mr. Anderson said it would not be necessary that night. The chauffeur subsequently informed the cook that the master and his wife had dined at Captain Fraser's and finished with sweets at Gopal's Hawaii shop. This explained the master's mirth to the cook's satisfaction. What happened the next day to Mr. Anderson need not be told. It is too painful and too dirty a story. The fact remains that Mr. Anderson had no solid food the next day either. He thought he should die of starvation. He did not know how much longer the curse was going to last, or what else was in store for him. On the morning of the third day, the bearer came and reported that a certain Indian fakir had invited Mr. Anderson to go and breakfast with him. How eagerly husband and wife went. The fakir lived in a miserable hut on the bank of the river. He invited the couple inside his hut and gave them bread and water. Here was clean, healthy-looking bread after all, and Mr. Anderson never counted how many loaves he ate, but he had never eaten food with greater relish and pleasure in his life before. After the meal, the fakir, who evidently knew Mr. Anderson, said, "Sahib, you are a great man, and a good man too. You are rich, and you think that riches can purchase everything. You are wrong. The giver of all things may turn gold into dust, and gold may, by his order, lose all its purchasing capacity. This you have seen during the last 2 days. You have annoyed a man who has no gold, but who has power. You think that the deputy commissioner has power, but he has not. The deputy commissioner gets his power from the king. The man whom you have offended got his power from the King of Kings. It is his pleasure that you should leave the station. The sooner you leave this place, Sahib, the better for you, or you will starve. You can stay as long as you like here, but you will eat no food outside this hut of mine. You can try. You can go now and come back for your dinner when you require it." Mr. Anderson came back to the fakir's cottage for his dinner with his wife at 9 in the evening. Early the next morning he left the station and never came back. Within a month he left India for good. The hospitable gentleman of the station, who had asked Mr. and Mrs. Anderson to have a meal with them, never forgot the occasion. This story, though it reads like a fairy tale, is nevertheless true. All the European gentlemen of J knew it, and any one of them happens to read these pages, he will be able to certify that every detail is correct. Next story. I'm a 32-year-old man, yet it is broad daylight. As I think about this, it haunts me to this day to the point that merely thinking about it just sends chills down my body. It makes me feel like a terrified child. I've only told this story to a handful of people over the past 10 years because of how terrifying an experience it was for me. But I feel it can be therapeutic to get it off my chest and share it with others. Maybe others have had a similar experience. To tell this story and give it justice, I have to tell you of an experience that happened 3 years before the terrifying encounter that I'm about to tell you afterwards. Buckle up, this will be something worth listening to. My name is Joshua, but I will change the names to protect the privacy of the others involved in this story. I lived in Arkansas in late 2003, near the middle of the fall, right before it started getting really cold. My wife and I were invited to camp with a friend of mine and his girlfriend at Sugarloaf Lake in Oklahoma. I say camp, but the actual plan was to meet at Sugarloaf, and my friend, we'll call him Bob, wanted to take me and my wife around to some paranormal places in the Sugarloaf area. So we got there around 7 p.m. I was driving a white Ford 1996 F-150. Bob was driving a 1980 something like a white celebrity. It was really a piece of crap vehicle. Anyway, it was late dusk, becoming dark, and we all climbed into Bob's car and he took us around the area. First to an old abandoned house, but other than some raccoons rustling around, it was a 2 hour waste of time. Then he took us to a graveyard that was supposed to be haunted. Again, a bust. Then an old church that was run down and supposed to be haunted. Once again, yawn. At this point, it was getting close to midnight, and my wife and I were getting pretty bored. And I spoke up to Bob, saying, "Man, this really hasn't been that freaky of a night." That's when Bob smiled, saying he was saving the best for last. He handed me a Polaroid picture of a hillside covered in trees and daylight. I asked him what it was, and he asked me if I saw a house or any type of light pole or anything in the picture, to which I replied, "No." He took the picture back and said that's because there isn't, and there are no power lines either. But this time he turned down an old dirt road and past a small house. Then after that, it was 2 miles of dirt road with woods on one side and a barbed wire fence on the other, with about 2 acres of field connecting to a wooded hillside. Nothing to light the night except the full moon above our heads and the clear starry sky. After what seemed like forever, he stopped the car and told us all to get out. We did as he asked. He walked us to the side of the car where the fence, field, and wooded hillside was. He looked at his cell phone, which his phone and mine had no signal. This was 2003, and this area had no cell towers, but he looked at his phone and said it was 11:57 and told us to watch the middle of the hillside. Even at complete darkness, I could tell this was the same field and hillside from the picture. 2 minutes go by and nothing has changed. Then, at exactly midnight, a small light flickers on in the middle of the hillside. A chill ran down my back as my wife, Bob, and his girlfriend and myself watched the small light, which to me looked like an old kerosene lantern, began to move, swaying back and forth. We sat and watched in complete silence for what seemed like several minutes when I finally spoke up and asked what the story was with this. Bob replied he did not know, but locals had told him that at midnight, every night, this lantern would light up and sway back and forth through the woods until the sun came up and it disappeared. Nobody knew what the story was. At the time, I was 19 years old, and I didn't think anything could scare me or hurt me, so since there were no houses around, I yelled, "We see you! Wow! You are so scary with your little lantern." Bob shushed me, but it was too late. My wife screamed and pointed. I was laughing, but my laughing stopped as I looked to the hillside to see the lantern swaying back and forth but moving down the hillside to the field at an inhuman pace. Gliding, it began to speed across the field towards our car. We didn't stick around to see what it was because within seconds we were in the car and flying down the dirt road back to the lake. We looked back to see the lantern moving slowly back up the hillside to where it first appeared. The ride back was silent until Bob's broke up, saying, "Crap, I forgot to put gas in earlier, and the only store around is closed. And if we decide to go back out anywhere, it'd best be to take my truck until he could gas it up in the morning, as he only had about half a quarter tank." I said okay, and a few minutes later we arrived back at Sugarloaf Lake. We had parked by the lake docks, and we dropped my tailgate and sat and talked about what just happened. Bob's girlfriend was pregnant at the time and told him she was hungry. He told her we had brought some snacks, but she said she needed actual food. But since the local store was closed, he asked if we could take my truck to the next town over to get some food because his car wouldn't have enough gas to get us to that town. I obliged. We shut our cooler, put the tailgate up, and loaded into my truck. I turned the key and nothing happened. I thought, well, is it dead? Was my truck dead? Deader than dead? No ding, no lights, no clicking noise, nothing. For all intents and purposes, you would think the alternator was out. This was strange, and after the night we had made it that we all felt very uneasy. We got out of the truck and popped the hood, pulled Bob's car around to the front and attempted to jump my truck with his car. This is where it gets even weirder. As soon as we connect the jumper cables to his battery and mine, his girlfriend starts his car, and within a second the cables in between the connectors start to smoke, and in a flash of fire they burn up within seconds. The cables were nothing more than bits of melted rubber and ash, with only the end clamps still on our batteries. Bob ran, turned off his car, and took the clamps off. We looked at each other in the eerie moonlight. Did I mention there were no light poles around? And we both got a bad feeling at the exact same time when we suddenly realized we had been hearing a distant noise in the lake that was getting louder. It was a boat motor. Now, like I said, this was the time of year it was starting to get cold, especially at night. We were bundled up as it was, and we were standing still at night, but somebody was out on the boat after midnight when it had to be chilly as all get out with the wind hitting them, and from the sound of this motor it was going pretty fast. But we saw nothing. That is until the boat was about 50 yards away, and a very bright spotlight came on temporarily blinding us. Bob and I told the woman to get in the car and lock the doors. I reached into the bed of my truck, gave Bob a tire tool, and I picked up another. I worked at a tire shop and had all kinds of tools of the trade in my truck. We were standing in front of the vehicles in the middle, the hoods up on both as the boat pulled up, and two heavily bearded men in their 30s to 40s stepped out of the boat and walked up to us. It's hard to give an accurate description as their spotlight was still pointed at us and it covered the men in an eerie shadow while blinding Bob and me. They looked at us and at our vehicles, and one glanced in the direction of the car at the women, then back at us, and let out a small chuckle. "You fellers got some sort of car trouble?" one asked as he lighted up a cigarette. "Yeah, but it's nothing we can't handle," I stammered. The guy with the cigarette sniffed the air and looked down between Bob and my feet and seized the still smoking ashes of what was the jumper cables. "Looks like it was more than your jumper cables could handle. You all need some help? We got some tools on the boat that I think can fix your problems." Then the other man, who had chuckled in the beginning, said, "Mm-hmm, fix them right up." I was speechless at the moment, probably with my mouth hanging open. I can't remember, as the two men walked back to their boat, and we heard what sounds like chains rattling around as we tried to make out what they were doing, but the spotlight was blinding us so we could barely see. But the chain noise was enough. Bob looked at me, and without saying another word, we both jumped in his car and drove the F out of there. For the next few hours, we drove to a populated area of houses, which wasn't many in the rural area, which meant we were pretty much stuck since we had very little fuel. But we all sat in the car mostly quiet, looking around in all directions in near panic, thinking at any time those men could find us. Bob would turn his lights on every now and then, thinking he had seen some movement in the dark. After a while, the women fell asleep, and Bob and I talked about how weird this whole ordeal had been, and he laughed, saying, I told you it'd be a scary night. I just didn't know it would be this sort of scary. At this point, the paranormal lantern wasn't even the main freaking thing out there. But the men never showed, and eventually the morning was on its way, and it was about 20 minutes till sunrise, and Bob asked if I wanted to go see if the lantern really disappeared at sunrise. I asked if he was sure he had enough gas, and he said yeah. The local store opened up in about an hour, so we would be fine. I told him in that case, then yeah. We woke the women up and drove back to the hillside. We got there within about 4 minutes, right before sunrise, and we could still see the lantern swaying in the woods. Bob looked at me, and I smiled and did the motion for zipping my lips, and we all watched in wonder as right at sunrise the lantern slowly faded away to nothing. After this, we got back in the car and drove back to the lake, feeling safe for now. When we got there was no sign of the boat, and the hood of my truck was still up, the door still locked. On a whim, I told Bob I'm going to try to start the truck one more time before he drives us somewhere where I can get a cell signal and call for help. And I'll be damned, the truck started right up with no hesitation or problem. We all went our separate ways, happy to have seen the sunrise and counting our blessings, and swearing to leave the paranormal investigating in this area to others, and swearing that we never wanted to come back to this area and run into the boat people again. However, all things fade with time, even fear and common sense. 3 years later, Bob, who I hadn't seen in almost 2 years at that point, called me up and said he had a proposition for me. He goes on to tell me he had a group consisting of himself and 3 other Wiccans who would go out and do seances in a haunted place, and asked me if I would be willing to film their sessions in the haunted place for their records, and that they would pay me well for my services. I'm no Wiccan, but I've always loved the paranormal. Even after what I went through at Sugarloaf, I still had an itch to scratch when it came to getting scared and dealing with the paranormal and the unknown, and I told him yes, I would love to film for them, but I had no interest in joining in what they were going to do, just watching and getting to be out there looking at the paranormal again. So, of course, my next question was, when and where were we going to be doing this? Then he answered me, and I got a terrible gut feeling, and I wished so much that I had trusted my gut and told him that I'd changed my mind. Remember the lantern light out near Sugarloaf? He asked, as if there was any way I could ever forget. Yeah, I stammered. Why do you ask? I told my group the story, and they want to do the ritual there and see if we can contact the spirit and find out why it's there and what it wants, Bob replied. I don't know, man, I said. Oh, come on, Josh. Trust me. You'll be safe. And I'm going to pay you $250 just to sit there and film it, he retorted. At the time, I was about to become a father, and money was tight because diapers, formula, and the like cost a small fortune. Not to mention it was my first kid and my new wife's first kid, so she'd been going crazy spending money on not just the necessities, but also buying only top of the line baby products like toys, crib, playpen, baby monitor, stroller, car seat, combination pack and playing changing table, diaper genie, and designer baby clothes. So, because my wife was putting us in the poorhouse, I had to weigh out my fear of the area he wanted to go back to with how important it was I make all the extra money I could. So, against my better judgment, I accepted the offer. And a week later, I was in that same beat-down celebrity Bob was driving 3 years before. This time with Bob and 2 guys and 1 girl that were complete strangers to me. They each were dressed very gothic and had these pentagram necklaces or something of the sort. It was 11:50 p.m. when we got there, and the 4 of them sat in a tight circle, and I was behind them to the right, about 5 feet from the barbed fence that was in front of the field that led to the hillside, and my back was to the hillside and bushes at the fence line, and I was filming my friend's circle as they all started chanting something. Now, as I'm thinking about it, even now I get knots in my stomach, just thinking what happened after they started their chanting. As a matter of fact, this story haunts my dreams, and even during waking hours to this day, it makes a chill run down my spine. But at that point, I was only thinking that I was interested in the paranormal, that it was a fun hobby to go out ghost hunting, or getting myself spooked or whatever. But the truth is, after that night, I never looked at the paranormal as fun or interesting anymore. I show it respect and stay as far away as possible as much as I dread it. But let me finish telling this story. As this group is chanting, Bob lights up this huge candle in the middle of them and opens up some sort of book. It's not like a scary antique spell book or anything. It looks like a newer hardcover. Anyway, he starts reciting words from it, and then he looks at his phone and tells his group to be quiet and look at the hill. I turn the camera, and at midnight, on the dot, the lantern appears. One member of Bob's group blurts out, "Cool." I roll my eyes, since the way these people were dressed and the way they carried themselves, the word cool didn't seem to fit in their vocabulary. Then Bob says to his group to join hands as they attempt to communicate with the spirit. I turn my back to the light and begin to film the group as they began again chanting, and Bob reads from the book. Then they start asking questions in hopes that the spirit will respond. About this time, a wind picks up and Bob's candle goes out. He tells everyone to hold on and tells me, "Cut the camera for a minute," and I oblige and stop recording and watch as Bob tries his lighter, then two lighters from his group, but none of the lighters are working. I'm sitting down watching the group when I start hearing a rustling behind me. I jumped up, leaving the camera on the ground, and spun around. Bob and his group are preoccupied with their candle and lighter problem, and as I spin around, I'm blinded by the brightest light I have ever seen. What I believe was the lantern up close and personal, but as quick as it appears, the light is gone, and the lantern is nowhere to be seen. If it had been the lantern that blinded me, it had moved from the hillside, across the field, and right behind me, without realizing it, within the span of maybe 30 seconds. I looked around for the lantern on the hillside and nothing. It was only 12:15 or so, and the light had always stayed until sunrise. At this moment, the wind quit blowing, and I heard Bob's lighter finally flick, and I see it light up, and I mutter, Guys, did you see that?" They all turn and ask what I'm talking about, but before I can answer them, we all stop dead in our tracks by a distant laughter coming from seemingly nowhere and everywhere around us, but distant at the moment, like far off. And this is no ordinary laughter. This laughter sounds like the laughter of hundreds, maybe even thousands of children that haunts me to this very moment. Now, the best way I can describe this laughter is for you to imagine listening to a large group of kids singing, "Row, row, row your boat." You know how one kid will start, and seconds later another will join in, starting at the beginning of the song, and so on and so forth. Well, this sounded like I said hundreds of thousands of children laughing, as if one would start laughing and seconds later another would, and that pattern went on in an endless loop. I'm not saying the laughter sounded like the song "Row, row, row your boat." I'm saying they laughed in unison just like kids do when singing "Row, row, row your boat." One would start, then seconds later another would, and then another and another and another, and the laughter was getting louder and closer. There was sinister laughing, goofy laughing, giggling all around us, coming from all directions. I was shaking. I could not move. I was spinning around and looking off in the distance. This couldn't be real. This sort of thing doesn't happen. What was happening? I screamed at Bob and his group that we needed to get out of there, but they're already running for the car, leaving their wick book and the candle behind. Without hesitation, I run after them and jump in the car just as the laughter is becoming deafening. We hauled ass out of there and drove about a mile up the road and pulled over, as Bob is in no condition to drive, as we were just freaking out. We got out of the car, paced around the car, asking each other if we really had just heard what we had heard. I told Bob, "I'm sorry, but I left his camera behind." He says he doesn't care and that he's not going back for it. At this point, I got my hands on my knees, panting, trying to catch my breath, as I've never in my life been so terrified. This is when all our chatter stops, as we once again hear the laughter off in the distance, very quietly at first, but slowly getting closer and closer and louder, until once again it's becoming deafening. We jumped back in the car and sped away. We drove about 6 miles, and for the first 3 miles We could still hear the laughter in the distance, with our windows down a little. We all began to calm a little by mile 4 when the laughter could no longer be heard. But we had no intentions of pulling over again, and Bob's friend is in the passenger seat with his phone waiting for a signal to pop up. And at about mile 6, Bob's friend says, "Hey, I got full bars." And he hands the phone to Bob, and he calls a friend of his who is into the occult and well versed and educated in it. And as we're driving, he's describing what happened to the lady. Bob later told me his friend told him she believed it was the children of Hecate or something like that. I have no idea about what Hecate is, but it sounded like more of a guess to me. Anyway, as Bob is on the phone speeding out of the area, me and the other 2 people in the back seat all get a chill at the same time. And they told me later that just like me, the hair on the back of their neck stood up as a loud snapping noise came from the front end of the car, and Bob's celebrity stops dead in its tracks and will no longer move forward. He tried everything, but the car's not moving. We later discovered that a tie rod had snapped. Anyway, the friend Bob was talking to on the phone only lived about 20 minutes away from where we were, and they said they were on their way. As we sat in the car, nobody spoke, and after about 3 minutes, we saw a pair of headlights coming down the road towards us. We knew it was too soon to be Bob's friend, but me and Bob thought maybe we could get a ride from a local, and we all unloaded out of the car and stood in front of it, waiting on the vehicle to hopefully stop. Now, I can't be certain, but my gut told me that I was correct. But the vehicle doesn't stop, but as it comes to view, it's a beat up old pickup truck, and it slows down. And the truck are 2 men in their 30s or 40s with huge beards, and they stare at us and speed up after passing by. I look at Bob, and before I can speak, he says what I was already thinking. "The guy's in the boat." Before I can say anything back, we see headlights coming from the other direction the truck that passed by just went, and we went still and quiet as the same guys in the same truck passed by slowly again, staring at us from the side of the road. Bob called his friend back and told her to drive like hell and get here now, and hung up. 4 or 5 minutes go by. We see headlights coming. Relieved, we all get our stuff ready, thinking it's Bob's friend. Then his phone rings. It was a lady who was coming to get us, telling Bob she took a wrong turn and it's going to be about 10 or 15 more minutes before she gets there. Bob hung up the phone and watched in terror, as did I and the others. The same truck slowly passes by again, this time with only one of the boatmen in the truck. This time, though, the driver slows to a crawl and says, "Looks like you fellers could use some help," and then speeds up and drives off. This cemented the fact to Bob and I that we were definitely dealing with the boat guys. But where the hell did the other guy go? Why wasn't he in the passenger seat? And to make matters worse, at this point, something we had almost completely forgot about due to the boatman was immediately reminded to us as we began to hear the laughter again off in the distance, but all around us like before. And over the next few minutes, it started getting closer and closer. I was just about pissing my pants at the sound, which is getting deafening, and we have nowhere to run this time. And then from behind our car, off in the distance, we see 2 sets of headlights come down and 2 vehicles coming towards us slowly, side by side, taking up the entire width of the backcountry dirt road, both coming our way. The laughter now seems to be coming from the woods on both sides of the road that we're stuck on, and the laughing feels like it's zeroing in on us as its hundreds of thousands of children are within reaching distance of us. There's no wind, no sound other than the crunch of the tires on the rocky dirt road of the 2 vehicles slowly driving towards us. With our last shred of hope fading away, the laughter of the children and the headlights of the 2 vehicles surely being driven by the boatmen, we're given a reprieve as in the other direction we see another set of headlights coming fast. We held our breath, the laughter of the boat, the men. What could be next? How will we get out of this? And that's when the vehicle that was coming fast pulls up, and it's Bob's friend. She unlocks the doors on her car, rolls her window down, and begins to tell us to get in. When this happens, the 2 sets of headlights coming from the other direction turn off, and Bob's friend says, "Oh my God, you weren't kidding about the laughing kids." She screamed at us to get in, which we did, and we began to tell her about the boat guys, and she turns the car around, and no sooner she starts to drive away, the 2 sets of headlights come on again, this time with their brights on, and they're about a car length behind the car we're all crammed in. I yelled to the driver, "Go, go, go!" channeling my inner Jeff Goldblum, telling her faster, must go faster. She floors it for about a mile. The two vehicles stay on our ass, then they turn off onto a side road. For about the next 2 miles after that, we can hear the laughter still way off in the distance with our window down. Then after 3 miles, the laughter was gone. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened. What the laughing children were, why the laughing followed us, if the boatmen were connected to all this somehow, or if they were merely a coincidence that happened to terrify us at the same time as the paranormal stuff was happening. And if that's the case, why didn't it react to the laughing children sound? Is the lantern connected to the laughing children, or did Bob and his group mistakenly call forth the laughing children through their ritual? Like I said, this happened years ago, but I still feel just as terrified now when I tell people about it or think about it. I have constant chills and goosebumps going over me whenever I go over it in my mind. Well, all I can say is think twice before you decide that you want to get involved in the paranormal. If you use it as a thrill seeking hobby, just use caution and always have your vehicle checked out beforehand. Oh, and watch out for seemingly sociopathic hillbillies and laughing children. Hope everyone who listens to this sleeps well. But I know that after telling my story like this, for at least the next few nights, I'll be getting no sleep at all.